A soldier who fought in the 24th Michigan came back for his reunion in 1889 for the dedication of his monument. And during his speech, he said, "Think back, if you will, and try to recall, as you fought the battle, any of the fine details of what you were experiencing. You knew you were going up a hill, but you did not take time to notice the tree cover or what kind of trees they were. Somebody later told you it was Oak Hill, and you integrated that into your future discussion. There were times when you passed through a field, but you didn't stop to notice what was in it, what kind of crops were growing in it. You did not have time, when the bullets were flying fast, to enter any of these details into your mental memorandum book." That phrase, your mental memorandum book, has stuck with me forever. There's another sentence, just one other line, and it comes from not a Civil War soldier, but from a World War II soldier. A lot of you are familiar with S.L.A. Marshall and his Men Against Fire, and what he said simply was this: "The battlefield is the lonesomest place which men share together." And if you remember those as a way to help shape what you can and cannot write, what you can or cannot tease out of a story, those are some of the best warnings about just what is possible to do and what is not possible to do when writing about combat.
If I can, to add to that, I would, back to your question, Chris, about whether or not somebody who's participating in a battle can actually really understand what's happening around him or her. I think one of the things that we all have to remember is that everyone's experience is unique, and not all combat is the same. A soldier's experience here at Gettysburg in 1863 would be vastly different from a soldier's experience in northern France 100 years ago today. Vastly different. We're talking about scale and scope and just the types of equipment and uniforms and the types of weapons and dangers that someone might face would be totally different at the Peach Orchard than they would be on the Somme in 1916. And so there may be some universal things that you can say, but again, I think it's very difficult to try to narrow that down. Now, does somebody ever really truly understand? I think there are examples in history of great captains, great commanders, who have absolutely understood what was happening. How else would they have been able to direct the activities of thousands of soldiers on the battlefield? But for the average person, I think that, as we just heard, that quote about 1,000 different universes occupied by one is pretty accurate. And those of you who have been in a combat situation in here probably understand that very well. I also think that for the average soldier, that his or her experience of combat is going to be shaped by how many times they've experienced combat. That for some of the soldiers that were out here at Gettysburg, this was just one more of many, many major battles that they had participated in. And one of the things that I've discovered, I'm actually a British military historian, is that in the British Army, a lot of the soldiers, particularly in the 19th century in the Victorian British Army, were some of the most combat experienced people on earth. There was not a single year in Queen Victoria's reign when the British Army didn't fight somebody someplace. And the British Army only had 300,000 soldiers in it at its largest point before World War I. So all of those men, and I can say men because there weren't any women in the Army back then, they had an extraordinary experience of combat, and many of them wrote, even down to the lowest levels, they wrote really, really perceptive, broad view reminiscences of their experiences, because they were able to get that sort of perspective based on experience. So I think, not to belabor the point, but I think as we try to get our minds around this and understand this issue, it's really important to understand that the context is everything, and that everyone's experience is very different, not just in terms of me or you or anyone else, but time and place, the circumstances, and so on. So to answer your question, my feeling is yes and no, which is a great historian's answer, because there's no one ever really knows the truth.
I'd just like to add to these to this that Chris's very good question. See, I'm buttering up to the moderator already. A brilliant question. Actually speaks to an issue that's been occupying people for the last 1,000 years or so. So we're definitely not the first ones to have ever asked this question about, hey, can you ever really know what battle is like without actually having been in one? And this goes back, as I said, a long time, and it's really a question about what could be called sort of eyewitness analysis of warfare versus flesh witnessing or flesh witness warfare. And by eyewitness, I'll take a very general and broad definition of this. That's basically someone who steps back and analyzes what happened, the combat and the warfare from afar. It's almost as if he's watching it from outside, as opposed to a flesh witness who quite literally has skin in the game. I mean, someone who's actually been in the fight or seen the elephant, as the Civil War expression has it. And so there's pluses and minuses to both of them. The problem with being a flesh witness is that obviously a soldier who's been in combat knows obviously what it's like to be in combat, but his experience, and speaking to what terrible names, Jim said, that really only a lot of the time his experience really only applies to him at that particular time, in that particular battle, at that particular time and space. Whereas an eyewitness, say an historian, or in the Middle Ages, a monk who would often write the chronicles of these things, they can take an almost objective bird's eye view of the whole affair, and they would analyze one source against another, because there's a whole lot of exaggeration that gets built into these things, and people get everything mixed up, and one soldier says he was there and another general says he was there, so they can actually by doing all of that, by putting all the sources together and analyzing them objectively and impartially, then you can actually get a true state or a true view of the battle. So I just want to speak to that actually it's a very, very, very old question, and it's a very interesting one. But you could also say that people like Homer, I mean, if he's whether he existed or not, the point is that he wrote a fantastic analysis of men in combat, and yet he probably seems to have been some sort of bard who probably didn't go into battle. Yet he seemed to understand the emotions and what happens in combat. So I just wanted to bring that point up.
First of all, for me, I'm in a kind of a unique position because I'm here with the Park Service, but I'm also here as a veteran. So I'm probably going to offend some of you tonight, and if I do so, it's because I'm a veteran, not because I'm with the Park Service. Okay, so
I've noted that.
Dr. Reardon brought up a very good definition. Combat is a parallel universe with only one common element, and that is the individual. All the things change. Your values change. What's your definition of a good day? You get a promotion. You get a child born. You get your tax refund back. Those are all good days, right? A good day is the day you're alive. A great day is the day you're alive and all your buddies are alive. That's a great day. A terrific day is when you're alive, your buddies are alive, and you have sent a bunch of people who deserve it to judgment. And it's that simple. It's a hard gap to close for a historian. They don't understand this parallel universe. I have a quote, I'm not pointing fingers, a well-known historian, but he's a member of one universe, and he has no contact with this other universe. And so he's going to talk about soldiers, nevertheless, to admit fear openly, even to family or close friends, comes hard for them. Some resort to denial. I never feel fear at all, wrote a soldier. Well, if that author, if that historian is afraid to die, he does not understand men who are not. He cannot write about it. So he says this soldier's in denial. There are soldiers that are not afraid to die. It's that simple. Their men, their buddies is more important. Doing their job is more important than living. So, try to close the gap.
Bill, I'm going to ask kind of a follow-up question on that, and I'm going to attempt not to offend Dr. Reardon and Rose when I say this. Do you think that non-veterans can honestly write about combat? Or does being a combat veteran give you an edge, an insight that those of us that aren't in that circle just can't ever have?
I'll take that one on, and I'll turn it over to Bill. But I think that it's absolutely legitimate for people who have not experienced combat to try to write about it. Most people who write about combat have never experienced it. So, the analysis and interpretation of events does not require experience of those particular events. It just requires an inquiring mind and a decent perspective. And I think that what we were just talking about previously would suggest to me that people who have experienced combat may have a difficult time writing about it in an objective way. I've thought for a long time about whether or not I should write about my experiences in Afghanistan, and I'm not ready to do that. I'm not really sure that I understand them right now, so it may be years before I can get to that. I'm much more comfortable writing about Queen Victoria's Army because I also feel, though, in reading the accounts that those people left behind, I do feel a little bit of a kindred understanding. But again, how could I possibly understand what it was like to fight against the dervishes at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898? There's no way that I could ever understand that. I do understand fighting against the Afghans in 1870, though, because it's exactly the same now. But yeah. So to answer your question, I think that those of us who have had the misfortune or the fortune, depending on how you look at it, of having experienced it, we don't have a corner on the market. Some of us may actually be precluded from writing about it effectively because of our experiences. So, again, a great liberal arts answer, which is it sort of depends.
Here's another liberal arts answer. And that is simply this. An awful lot of us who go into military history and go through a traditional program of graduate education in the field of history, we put on blinders fairly early on when it comes to the source material that we use, the approaches that we use, the methods that we rely upon, and we come up with, well, almost all your history books that talk about a battle kind of sound the same when they start talking about the battle narrative after a certain point. And one of the things that has been very difficult for those of us who live most of our lives in the academic world, one of the toughest things for us to do is to reach beyond our own discipline and find useful tools and useful insights from other fields. For instance, when I tackled Pickett's Charge in History and Memory, and some of you I know have read that book, I had to start delving into the world of psychology and social psychology, what they now call memory studies and that sort of thing, to give myself the toolkit I needed to be able to write that book and explain it from more than the strictly historical perspective. When it comes to writing about combat, what some of us, and not all of us unfortunately, but what some of us in the academic history world are doing is beginning to reach out to other fields such as kinesiology, physiology, social psychology, sociology, and a number of other fields. I'm really fortunate that I have a bachelor's degree in biology, so all of a sudden I can actually read that science stuff and it makes sense to me, which is actually very useful. But it turns out that you're learning all kinds of things about training regimens and why some work and why some don't, and how they have an impact on the battlefield that can explain why some things happen the way they do. There's all kinds of things that we don't really think about. Okay, here's one. I wrote a book about an attack squadron in Vietnam. They flew the A-6 Intruder. And I actually had to sit down. It was the first time in my experience where I could actually look at the people I was writing about and I could not just interview my source material, but they could argue with me if they didn't like my interpretation of it. But even better, they could correct me when I went off track. It made me a better historian even when I do Civil War things. But after they got comfortable with me, and after I had gained their trust, once they realized that I was respecting their experience, they were beginning to open up to me to things that I can guarantee you're not going to find in a Civil War book. Now, I'm going to have to be the one that says this up here, okay? One of the things that this group of aviators told me about was the importance in going through a ritual preparation for each one of their missions before they flew their missions. So I'm sitting there thinking about, okay, the briefing process and suiting up and all that. And they're going, no, no. And they're all grinning. And I didn't know what it meant until finally somebody looked and goes, we're going to tell you a secret now. Okay? It's the most important thing we do before we get into our aircraft. Yeah? We're going to clean this up a little bit, but we're going to call it the combat crap. We all head off to the bathroom before we mount up and get off to go off on our missions. We're only going to be gone for 90 minutes. We can hold it, but there's other things that we're thinking about. And we go, so you've probably just learned something tonight. I never heard about that. Find me a Civil War book about the importance of why the soldiers kind of slipped out of ranks for a couple minutes before going into battle, and you find out a lot more. That as the adrenaline rush is beginning to build, and you're preparing yourself for battle, and perhaps some of you guys, you snickered at just the right time, so I have a hunch or something to this. There are some rituals, and this one apparently is a fairly common one. There's nothing in traditional history methodology that would have led me to the combat crap. It comes from reaching out, not only talking to veterans, but then following up the physiology and the psychology and the other things that helps to explain why that matters. And if that's the only thing you remember when you leave here, I'm really sorry. But it's something like that that opens, it's the constant reminder to me that there's always so much more about this experience to learn. And those of us who come from the academic world have to kind of put ego aside and remind ourselves that there's plenty of other people out there and other fields of study that have things to contribute to this dialogue. And if we can do that, we'll do our work much better.
Telling Dr. Reardon out in the hall before tonight, I said, I read your book on Pickett's Charge many years ago, and I talked to her briefly, and I said I knew two things when I read her accounts. One, she'd walked the ground, literally, and the second thing is that she's very good at getting close, and I always appreciated that. I had recently, 6 months ago or so, I was talking to a veteran that we have dinners at the VFW and when they're in town visiting. And so we're talking, and he's on after his third tour, and he looked at me because I was asking him about how he slept at night. And if you're a member of the club, you'll know what I'm talking about. And he said, well, he's doing okay. And then he looked at me and he said, does it ever change? I said, no, it doesn't. He said, I have 1 foot in one world and 1 foot in the other world. How do I tell my wife I'd rather be in the other world? I love her, but getting my daughter to soccer practice is not important. He said, does it ever change? I said, no. These people will be your friends for life. The bonds that you have created with these people will never change. An incident happened a year and a half ago. I'm sitting at my computer, and all of a sudden I get an email. I have not heard from this man for 44 years. Here's his email. Bill, I just found out about your new book, saw the photo, recognized you right away. I hope you'll remember me. Of course I remember you. And he goes on after we've exchanged emails for a while. I've always wondered where you went in life, old friend, and glad to know you're doing well. If you ever get out my way, I would like to meet, same, if I come to Gettysburg. This is what it's about. The bonding is very strong. You cannot understand it. So,
to piggyback on that a little bit, there's a great book written by a Confederate veteran named Barry Benson, and in the conclusion to his book, he kind of writes about this longing to kind of return to the Army, to the days of 61 to 65, and he says at the end, he envisions a moment when the long roll will again, echo across the landscape, and he says, was it not real? Was it not as in the old days? And to again kind of get to Bill's point, why do so many soldiers, after they leave the service of the military, long for that return? Is it just the camaraderie, or is it more? Is it something else?
Just real quick to address that, here's another great quote. One of my favorite people, Winston Churchill, wrote of his first experience in combat as a subaltern in the 4th Hussars up on the Northwest Frontier Province in what is now Pakistan. He said, "There's nothing quite so exhilarating as to be shot at without effect." And he was absolutely correct. There is nothing as exhilarating as being shot at without effect. And exhilarating, just think of all the different nuances of what that word can mean. A relief, a release in the sense that, oh, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. A recognition that, yes, you can deal with this. And then even a defiance. Haha, you missed. You know what? Now I'm going to get you. I think that in my own experience, and virtually every single other person that I've spoken to, whether they had a positive experience in the military or not, they will always, to some degree, miss it. I'm here with an old friend that we were lieutenants together in the Army many years ago, and we were just talking about that he hasn't been in the Army for almost 20 years, but he still thinks about it every single day. And he was in the demilitarized zone in Korea. My father-in-law was drafted in the early 1950s, and instead of going to Korea, he unfortunately was sent to an infantry battalion on occupation duties outside Salzburg in Austria. It was a terrible assignment. He was really upset about that. But he was only in the Army for 2.5 years, and every single day he still talks about it as being this seminal experience for him. And he didn't even see combat. The war poets that are so famous from World War I, people like Siegfried Sassoon especially, have this complicated relationship with their military service and with their combat experience. Siegfried Sassoon is interesting as a war poet from World War I because he wrote poems that talked about the horror and the awful nature of war and how it was not honorable and it was not glorious, it was just awful. But then he also wrote poems about how there was nothing as ennobling as serving with fellow soldiers in that environment. So, I think to make another Civil War analogy about that, famously, Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Fredericksburg looking down on Marye's Heights as the Union Army was forming up once again to charge up that field, that incredibly bloody field, as Longstreet's Corps continued to mow them down as they were trying to come up those heights. And Lee looked at Longstreet and said, "It's well that war is so terrible. Otherwise we would love it too much." And I think that, at least from my own experience and from reading widely in the Victorian British Army, that the intensity of life can never be achieved again after you've done that. When I came home from Afghanistan, literally the next week my daughter graduated from high school, my oldest daughter, and I was bored. And I felt awfully guilty. I still do. She wanted me to go to the prom and see everything, and I did, but I was completely uninterested, which was a big mistake, because it wasn't intense. There weren't people who were trying to kill me. And I was surrounded by these people who just didn't get it. and I think most people have that to some degree. I think with time and distance, it abates somewhat. But I have never met someone who served in the military who didn't have at least some good memories about it, and especially those who have been in combat didn't at some level want to go back. Because missing that intensity of life, you never live life that intensely ever again. And that's why, guys that I've worked with, I was telling somebody earlier this week, when I arrived in Afghanistan, it was in 2005, and I was serving with Special Forces soldiers who had been there 6 to 8 times already in 2005. And I said, why do you keep coming back? Well, because I'm still in the Army and I have to, but that's not really true. I come back because I want to. Because to be with these people and to do this thing, it's addictive. And again, I don't know that that's universal, but I suspect that if it's not universal, it's darn close.
It's a little corollary to that Winston Churchill line. It was involving a very young George Washington during the French and Indian War, after his first time in battle, he wrote a letter, and I'm paraphrasing, our great founding father, of course, saying, "I had a fantastic time. All the bullets were just whizzing around me. It was great." And word of this got back to George II in England, and who was a sort of a grizzled old warhorse himself, and all he grumbled was, well, he won't be saying that once he's been in a few more. And so, there's just to pick up on what everyone else is saying. There's a certain there's something about military service that does call you back in many ways. I mean, there's the comradeship. There's this again, small group dynamics of the whole thing. The intensity of the real band of brothers sort of aspect to the whole thing. And I think that's almost universal. I mean, my late grandfather fought in 3 armies during the Second World War, not the German one, and I was basically the only one he didn't fight in. He fought in the North African campaign and up through Italy and so on. And he never really spoke about the war at all. Though he had a good war, he never got hit. He saw Mussolini's body. It's all, I guess, entertaining in a way. But he never. Again, he had the odd fond story about it. Usually involving funny stories that involve sort of naked, drunk Scotsmen, and almost shooting them and that kind of thing.
That's the best kind, right?
It's the only kind. Again, what I always question though is the whether the small group dynamic, the comradeship, is something that's actually universal. That is the one stumbling block I have, and what I wonder is whether we're imposing a post-romantic, as in a romantic sort of movement from the late 1800 onwards, and we're imposing this view of what it is like to be a soldier and these bonds of friendship and all that kind of thing. Whether we're imposing this on people who lived 600 years ago. For instance, did knights of did King Edward III's knights going into Scotland, did they feel the same way? Or was there something more going on with them? For instance, like if you take them, and I've looked at a lot of the records that they've left. The militiamen who fought at Bunker Hill in June 1775. This is just before the Romantic era, so it's still the Enlightenment. It's very sort of starchy and buttoned up, and you keep what you're thinking inside of you, and it's an honor system. And I've read a lot of their diaries, and not a single one. The only guy I've ever seen is Washington, sort of cheering about how much fun it was. Not a single one of them talks about what it was like to be in battle. These are letters home. These are their diaries and letters written on the day or day after they were in combat at Bunker Hill, which would be the bloodiest day of the entire revolution. And you know what they're talking about? They're talking about what time they went to church that day. And the weather's a bit sunny today, and I'd really like to get going home because the corn's coming up. They don't talk about their own emotions and their bonds of friendship with the rest of their company. Now, some of this could just be, well, they don't feel the need to mention it because the companies at Bunker Hill, they were like 30, 40 men per company, and they were almost universally from one particular little town, and they were all kind of related and intermarried and all that kind of stuff. So maybe they, of course, they felt bonds of kinship with them, but they don't speak about their combat experience, and so that's something that you see. Again, it's a sort of a development about the emotions and introspection and memories and that kind of thing that only takes place about 50 years later, from about 1800, from the late Napoleonic Wars onwards. That's when you see it really coming in. And so that's the one stumbling block I have is whether the small group dynamic, the band of brothers ethos, is really just a modern thing that we impose on others. Personally, I think it probably was the case in many ways.
Shakespeare refers to it in Henry V.
Well, yeah. No, absolutely. But the thing is that those are different kinds of armies, and and that's Henry V in trying to impose this sort of form of Englishness, and that was also 200 years after it actually happened, and so on. So again, again, I don't really know, and again, just give another liberal arts answer, fuzzy liberal arts answer. I don't know, maybe. Yes or no. Fuzzle. So yeah, that's the one problem I always have with the small group dynamics. But I bow to their superior knowledge.
Well, there are certainly soldiers' experiences that were incredibly isolating. Not everybody had a great time, and many of us have known and spoken with people who did not. I actually had the great fortune once when I was an ROTC instructor at the University of Maine to speak with a veteran who had been at the University of Maine in something called the Army's Technical Specialist Corps during World War II, where men were sent to universities to get engineering and chemical degrees and so on to serve in sort of these technical specialties in the military. And then in 1945, in the Northwest European campaign, there was a huge need for infantry replacements, and so the Army Technical Specialist Program was shut down, and all of these men who had been college students were sent without basic training to infantry units in Northwest Europe and just sent directly into combat. And I spoke to this guy, and he had been a combat stress casualty, because he said, I lasted 50 days. He said, I showed up, I was a new guy, I was with a bunch of other new guys that nobody knew, we didn't know each other, we hadn't been through any training together. We got off a truck, we showed up at the unit, the NCO told us to drop our stuff over here, and said our briefing, welcome to the unit, was here's your rifle, make sure you keep it clean, do as you're told, and don't get killed. And he said after that no one talked to us ever again. He said because no one would talk to us because they knew that we were going to die and they didn't want to get close to us. And he said so that the 50 days, about the first month that he was in this unit, no one talked to him. And he was just by himself, left to deal with this horrifying experience, literally, of being a college student at the University of Maine and a month later being dropped off at a truck in some of the most high-intensity combat of World War II. And he said he broke. And as he was telling me this, he was teared up, and he said, I'm ashamed to say it. And I said, you shouldn't be ashamed. You should be proud of the fact that you actually told me that. But who wouldn't? And he was an ardent pacifist, and had protested the war in Korea and had protested the war in Vietnam, and was getting ready to protest the war in Iraq, and was adamantly opposed to mandatory military service of any kind, and yet was proud that he had served his country during the Second World War. So yeah, I don't think that small group dynamic applies to everybody. So again, I mean, any human experience, there's no such thing as a common denominator, really. I think everybody's an individual. So.
We've jumped around a lot. That's okay. We've gone from Agincourt with Henry V to the bathrooms of Vietnam with Dr. Reardon. But it seems like there's a common thread through this, and that's fear, the anxiety that goes along with being in combat. And my question, I guess, is how have soldiers throughout history, particularly American history, how have they dealt with fear or processed this fear or anxiety? is there ever a point in time where combat becomes the norm, where they get used to it, accustomed to it, where it doesn't have that maybe edge that those of us who've never been in combat assume it must have?
There's a wonderful book on Vietnam of a helicopter pilot. Bob Mason is his name. The book is entitled Chicken Hawk, and it's a vicious, brutal book, and not. I would not want to recommend that you read it, because you will not. But he has a couple paragraphs that I think for tonight can make a point. And he talked about going through the transition. Is he a chicken or is he a hawk? Is he going to be able to withstand and do his job? Or is he not? Is he a chicken? Or is he a hawk? Is he going to get in there and do his job all the time? And he resolved in trying to reason through this that he was actually a chicken hawk, a combination. He said, at the end of a tough day, I did not want to do it again. If there was uncertainty and there was a lull and I was off for a couple of days, I didn't want to have to go back. A chicken. But when the radio cracked, when he heard the rifles, he said, you could not keep me out of it. The hawk. And so the soldiers are somewhere in that line. Are they chicken or are they hawk? Or are they a chicken hawk? Back and forth with the hurricane buffering them. Knowing what they did the day before is all they have. They don't know if it'll happen tomorrow, that they'll do their job. Not everybody's a chicken, not everybody's a hawk. But if you know a hawk, some of you do maybe here, but if you know a hawk, he is a magnificent soldier. You cannot keep him away. There are stories you can go on the internet and see. We have some wonderful hawks that are not fully appreciated.
This being the 100th anniversary of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, reminded me of some of the effort among especially the British, but some other nations as well, in the years between the Great War, the war to end all wars that turned out not to be, and of course World War II, when there was a great deal of discussion and philosophizing about fear and courage and the nature of courage. And it wasn't, courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acknowledging the fear and pushing on anyway. But the nature of that courage, the nature of just how you kept going when things were so bad, was a matter of a great deal of concern and discussion. There were several different schools of thought. One of them said that we are all born with a finite amount of courage, that we can tolerate, we can put up with, we can push through whatever is out there ahead of us until that point comes when that pool of courage we have is empty. And when it's empty, there's no getting anything back. We all have our point. All of us have been through tough things, and somehow we kept pushing on until maybe for some of us that came that point where we said, no, I quit. I can't do this anymore. That's one school of thought. The other said simply that courage is a renewable resource, that there might be times, in fact, when that pool gets a little bit emptied. It seems like it's draining very quickly. But then maybe it's rest or relaxation. Maybe it's just getting away from the immediate stressors for a little while. You can go back in, and somehow, some way, you can just keep on going. Nobody ever comes to final conclusions on these sorts of things. It's all part of the discussion. We still have them today. One of the ways that somebody else tried to answer the question is to leave the realm of philosophy and go back to the world of physiology and kinesiology, and basically say, especially if you are in battle, and you are in battle that extends for a long, long time. There might come that point where your spirit is willing, but your body's going to give out on you. Your body's going to tell you that you've had enough. You might want to keep going, but you can't keep going. You're going to beat yourself up because you can't keep going, but it might happen. We won't see this so much at Gettysburg, but if we take the survivors of Gettysburg and take them 10 months into the future to Spotsylvania, to the Overland Campaign, we start seeing some really interesting things coming out of that campaign that we haven't seen earlier in the Civil War. We take a look at the battles of the early part of the Civil War. Antietam is 1 day, Fredericksburg is 1 day, Chancellorsville's 2 or 3 days, Gettysburg's 3. Maybe you don't even fight for all 3 of those days. But then you launch off into the Battle of the Wilderness and then go straight to Spotsylvania and then off to Cold Harbor. And you are either marching or fighting or maneuvering or digging constantly for almost the better part of 6 weeks before it's all over, before you end up around Petersburg. And at some point, you are going to become exhausted. Physically, emotionally, morally, mentally exhausted because of everything you will see and do and happen around you. I'm sure that there are a number of you who have read a great deal about the Battle of Spotsylvania. And one of the things that really made me very curious were some accounts that I read, especially about the fighting at the Bloody Angle. That was a fight that went for almost 14 hours without cessation, without a whole lot of reinforcements coming in. The same troops that started are basically the guys who were there all day. And there were accounts of soldiers who, after fighting for any number of hours, simply pulled themselves back off the line, or just kind of dragged themselves off the line, curled up behind any bit of cover they could find, and fell asleep. And then after a certain amount of time, they woke up, picked up their weapon, went back to the firing line, and continued to fire as if nothing had happened at all. And somehow, those of us who have never experienced it, we kind of marvel at this. They decided to take a nap. It seems like this is impossible that they could possibly do this. Well, the explanation is not always one of physical exhaustion. There are so many other competing emotions and responses to stressors going on in there that are a response to you can handle fear for so long, and then at a certain point you can't. You can handle the stress for so long, and then you can't. And you have to find some way of dealing with it. Maybe taking the nap will do that. So when it comes to defining such things as fear, ways to control fear, ways to work around it and get back into the fight, we've probably all read about them. Maybe we haven't always recognized them, but we're beginning to get the tools that we need to begin to talk about these things a bit more. The discussion's been going on for years. It'll continue.
I've always been interested in two aspects of fear and stress in combat. The first is just referring to what Carol was talking about, is physiological. What is going on inside your body during combat, and the second is sort of practical measures that soldiers have historically taken to mitigate fear and stress, which are often at their highest actually just before they go into actual combat, the actual fear. Physiologically, it's quite interesting. If you, a resting heartbeat for a regular person is about 70 beats per minute. That's what we've all got right now, unless some of you are preternaturally excited by my speaking style, but you're hiding it well, and that's fine. But then, as you go into combat, once your heart rate rises to about 115 to 145, which is essentially a hard workout on the Stairmaster or something at the gym, you're actually at your physical peak. Your reaction times are very, very high or elevated. Your motor skills are fantastic. Your visual and sensory perceptions are unbelievably good. You react very quickly. You feel like a superhuman. You're really, you're at the top of and you feel great, and everything is in all the emotions. Not emotions. All the chemicals are kicking in. It's a fantastic feeling, and that's when soldiers are at their best. Now the problem is when you get to above 150 beats per minute. What you tend to get is your gross motor skills are breaking down, your fine motor skills are breaking down. You won't be able to pull a trigger properly. I mean, you tend to slip a lot, and you tend to almost regress into infantility, or real animal emotion. And once you get to 170 beats per minute, which is, your heart is basically beating its maximum. That's when you get the famous phenomenon of fight or flight. Basically, that's when you almost stop in your tracks. And you read stories about this. Soldiers who just suddenly they're in the middle of something, and suddenly they just stop in the middle of a battlefield for reasons they don't know, and they can't remember why. It's because their heartbeats are so high, and their bodies are now at their maximum level of gross motor power. That is charging or running. So if they decide to go ahead, their charging power is unbelievable. That's when you often find men being able to sort of swoop over trenches and that kind of thing and take fortified positions and win medals of honor and things like that. But if they go the other way, if they run, that's when you see a wholesale collapse of a unit, especially since fear is it's like electricity. It sort of passes from one person to another very quickly. That's when you see almost an instant collapse of a formation. So those are the physiological aspects of fear and stress, which is one of the reasons precisely why before a battle you'll often find soldiers, and not just now, but 100 years ago at Gettysburg, at Bunker Hill, 1,000 years ago, you'll often find soldiers just repeating the same kind of ritual. In most cases, it's the manual arms. They'll sort of go over, just boring stuff like they'll clean their rifle 15 times in a row. They'll just the officers will find some way of lining them all up, running through the whole thing, sit down, do it all over again a minute or two later. It's because it's so boring that it takes their minds off what they're actually scared of. And I think there was what's his name? A very, very famous, I'm sure someone here is going to know. He was from Maine. He was the commander, I think, of the... Sorry? See? This is the one place everyone's going to know that. I was going to say Jeff Daniels. But he once said, he wrote in his memoirs somewhere, that he used to fortify his men by just saying, before they were about to charge, okay, guys, again, I'm paraphrasing, 10 minutes in hell and then you're out of it. So just go. And so that would contain their fear, and they would just go ahead as long as they knew there was a way out. So that's, again, those are interesting aspects. I always find quite fascinating, the physiological and the practical measures that can be used to combat, or, as I said, reduce stress and fear.
There's all sorts of things that everybody's read about, different things that people will do, and I think the ritual is really important to understand. There's also self-medication. Most of you probably know this, maybe you don't, that the United States military right now is the only NATO military that does not allow its service members to drink when deployed. All the other ones not only allow their soldiers to drink, but give them an alcohol ration. And they always have. In fact, the United States Army used to have an alcohol ration. When I first came in the Army, we were allowed to drink when we were deployed, but that doesn't happen anymore, and I'm not sure that that's a good idea. I'm not in uniform anymore, so I can say that. In fact, I think it's a really dumb idea. For very good reasons, because there's a reason why you need to self-medicate. That's why up until the 1970s, all C rations had cigarettes in them for self-medication purposes. But French field rations have a little bottle of wine in them. I know the British Army issues soldiers a certain amount of beer every day, and so does the German Army. It's part of their pay. In World War I, just before going over the top at the Battle of the Somme, every single British infantryman was given his rum ration for the day. And rum back then, for the British Army, was not like the kind of rum that you buy at the liquor store today. It was gasoline. It was the same. It was moonshine, essentially. And so you say, well, how were these guys able to do this? Well, because they had their rum ration. And it may be funny, but it's true that there are ways to do this, and self-medication is certainly one of them. Those of us who are veterans know lots of people who are veterans who continue to self-medicate even after the fact, which is not a good thing, and that's a problem that we have, a social problem in this country. one of the other things that I find is really interesting is traditions and talismans. Famously here at the Civil War, on a Civil War battlefield, we think of the regimental colors. We talked about the 16th Maine, which is one of my favorite units. That their regimental colors were so important to them that on the first day of the battle, as they were about to be completely surrounded and over 200 of them were captured, rather than allow their regimental colors to fall into the hands of the enemy, they tore it off the staff, and the soldiers in the unit tore it up into little pieces, and each one kept a piece. And if you go to the Maine State Museum now in Augusta, at the state capitol, there's a display where they've recovered a number of those pieces of the 16th Maine's colors, where you can see them pieced together. That talisman was so important to them. It meant something to them, and it helped them deal with and regimental colors and all those kinds of things. Regimental traditions all help people deal with these kinds of stresses and fear. That if you famously, Lord Clyde, Colin Campbell, who was the commander of the British Highland Brigade at the Battle of the Alma in the Crimean War, turned around and said to the Highland Brigade before they charged the Russian heights, the heights of the Alma, he said famously to them, any man who leaves his post will have his name stuck up in his parish church at home. Okay. That's a pretty powerful motivator if you're a Presbyterian Scot. You don't want the parish priest or the pastor reading your name out that you were a coward. So there's all kinds of things like that. The traditions become very important. One of the really interesting ones, again, today's the 100th anniversary of the opening of the Battle of the Somme. Famously, the British Army lost 20,000 soldiers that day, dead, in one day, and about 30,000 to 40,000 other casualties, 60,000 in one day. There were a number of British units. The most famous one is the 8th Battalion of the East Surrey Regiment, where the company commander had purchased soccer balls on his last leave before the battle and brought them back to the unit and gave one soccer ball to each one of the platoons and said to the company, the first platoon that kicks their soccer ball across no man's land and puts it into the enemy's trenches will get a pass. And so famously the Surreys played the game. They dribbled their soccer balls across no man's land on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And sometimes we think of that as, oh, what a ridiculous, one more example of asinine British officers who don't understand anything about modern war, the donkeys and all this kind of thing. That's not true at all. Anyone who's been in the military understands that that was a very calculated move to get them to focus on something other than imminent death. Unfortunately, the company commander was killed right after he left his trench, but I think 2 of the soccer balls are still in the regimental museum. These kinds of things happen all the time, and every unit, the 1st Wisconsin with their eagle, on the Irish Brigade's monument over near the wheat field, there's a wolfhound on the monument. The Fighting 69th, which still exists in the New York National Guard, when they lead the New York St. Patrick's Day parade every year, they have their wolfhound with them, and it's there's a wolfhound on their monument here on the battlefield. So there's lots of different ways that this happens, so some of these crazy, almost ridiculous military traditions exist for, I think, really important reasons. And for those who are not in the military, let's make sure that we keep those traditions and we don't dismiss them, and we allow them to continue, however ridiculous or sophomoric we might think that they are, because they exist for very powerful reasons. That's my soapbox.
We were talking, Chris, about fear, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit, fear and courage, because they're somewhat related. I'm going to quote a Connecticut veteran in 1864, and he says, "I have spent much time analyzing my feelings and those of others before going into battles. It is the fear of death that makes men cowards." And so, let me carry that a little bit forward. The fear of death. And so if you don't fear death, where's the sting? Here's an account of a 10th Mountain Division fella in Somalia, Mogadishu. You might recall Delta Force had some of its elements cut up, and the Ranger Battalion went in and suffered some casualties as well. And then 10th Mountain tried to go in and relieve the pressure on those fellas, and they got stopped, and they were not doing well. They were getting cut up again. And men in the 10th Mountain realized they had to vacate. They couldn't get through. And so now they're going to try to get back to some place of safety. And I wanted to read you, there was a quote from one of the men. "There was only one time when I could feel that fear in me. It was it was on the run out of the city. There were 25 of us running, and there was no help. There were no tanks, no air support. There's just you running. The emotion of that moment starts to cloud your better judgment. For me, I always felt that if I had options, that I was not fearful, because I had options and I could reason through them. And so there was one day I played with fear a little bit. Our base camp had been under fire, and those people had gotten into our ammunition areas, and so we were in our bunkers for a while, about 5 hours. We had about 10 or 12,000 rounds flying around. And so I thought I'd just play with fear a little bit, because I hadn't played with it too much. And so I said, let's just see. I'm sitting here, it's a long time, I can't do anything. And I tried to create fear in me, and I could, because I had uncertainty, and I didn't know how the day was going to end. And I said, well, okay, this is enough of this stuff, because this is a powerful thing. Fear is a very powerful thing if you let it. And so then I walked on over to the edge of the bunker so I could feel the blast a little bit and kind of knock some sense back into me. And that's how I stopped that for a little bit. So now so the other side of that is courage. Is it courageous for a hawk to act like a hawk? You will ask him and he'll say, no, I'm just doing what the hawk does. Where is the courage then? The courage is when the chicken hawk acts like the hawk. The courage is when the chicken acts like the chicken hawk, because he's doing more than what he expected he was able to do. And so if you ask a Medal of Honor winner or any other soldier, well, that was courageous. No, I know some other fellas. Why are they saying that? They're honest. The other fellas were the courageous ones, not me. So.
This is my last question before we turn it over to the audience. And we've mentioned the Psalm a lot. And certainly I'm not in the UK right now, but what I've seen of their commemoration of that first day has been overwhelmingly somber, mournful, I would say, reflective. And Americans, it seems, are much more celebratory regarding their battles, be it the Battle of Gettysburg. Americans, in our commemoration, we tend to have less of that mournful feeling. Dr. Rose mentioned Bunker Hill. I worked at Bunker Hill for 2 years, and every year on the anniversary of the battle, we take part in a parade. It was very celebratory. My question is this: one, is that an American thing? And two, how should people remember places like Gettysburg when they come here?
I just speak to the British experience a little bit. For those of you who are so inclined, something really interesting happened today. All throughout the London subway systems and streets and high streets and so on, all around Britain, from Glasgow to southern England and into Wales, as part of the commemoration of the First Battle of the Somme, reenactors, young men, were dressed in British World War I uniforms and just showed up on train platforms and stood in groups silently in uniforms, in period uniforms, and each of them had cards to give out to passersby that had the names, the regiments, and the hometowns of men who were killed on July 1st, 1916. It happened all over the British Isles, and they were silent, and they just stood in groups or walked through the park together, and they would just hand cards to people. And it was all over the British social media today because it was unannounced. Nobody knew that it was going to happen. Very, very powerful and somber. And I think that the World War I experience for Europeans is something that we cannot fathom. Millions of young men killed, and for many in Europe, it's viewed as an entirely unnecessary and futile loss of life because 20 years later they had to turn right around and fight World War II. And you know, for the French especially, I think World War I has scarred that country's psyche ever since. You can't understand French actions in 1940, for example, without understanding what happened to France from 1914 to 1918. The French army took 500,000 casualties in the first 6 months of 1914, in the first 6 months of the war. 500,000. They were losing 2,000 soldiers a day. That's unimaginable to us today. In the 16 years that we've been fighting since 9/11, we've lost less than 7,000 in this country. And they lost 2,000 a day for the first 5 months of the war. So I think they don't celebrate that. They commemorate it. They're proud of service. But I think especially regarding World War I, they have a very different outlook on that than we do. But they do celebrate some things. When they celebrate Nelson's victory at Trafalgar, for example, in Britain, it's a very happy celebration because it was an extraordinary victory. And likewise, elsewhere in Europe, they look at things like that when they commemorate Waterloo, for example. I don't think that's a very somber experience for the British anyway, maybe not the French. Germany, of course, is a different story entirely. They don't commemorate anything that has to do with their military history, and I think rightly so. So I don't know that it's uniquely American. I think one of the things about being an American is that we are very ahistorical, that Americans tend to not really think about the past. America is very forward-focused, and I think that's one of the great things about the United States, that most people don't even, as Park Service employees, I'm sure you guys have experienced a lot of people who show up at this battlefield and have no idea what it is or why it's here. That's very American. And the other thing I think about Americans is that we're triumphalist. We win. We won. And so, we're going to celebrate the fact that we won. We don't talk about the things that we didn't really win. We don't celebrate or commemorate really the Tet Offensive or other bad experiences like the Chosin Reservoir or Little Bighorn. And I think, yes, so there are some unique American aspects to it, but I think we don't have those same experiences that a lot of other countries do with warfare. And I'll just leave you with this and turn it over to the other members of the panel. I served in Afghanistan with a very close friend. He's a really close friend of mine now. He's a British Army officer from the 1st Battalion, Worcestershire and Sherwood Foresters Regiment, which is a mouthful. And he was a major. He's about 6 or 8 years younger than me. And when we were in Afghanistan together, he had already been in the Falklands, Northern Ireland twice, Cyprus, Iraq, and then he was in Afghanistan. And we had a ramp ceremony in Bagram Airfield where whenever they were going to bring remains of fallen soldiers home, they would drive them on a vehicle down the main drag of the air base onto the airfield, put them on the ramp, and then fly them away. And when they were doing that, everybody would come out onto the street. So the entire base would shut down for a few minutes. Everybody would walk out, line the road, and salute as the casket went by. And I didn't really know him very well. We were working together, but he had just arrived. And so one of these ceremonies happened, and we went out, we're standing there next to each other, and as the casket went by, we all saluted, and he smartly saluted, and as the casket went by, he murmured under his breath, "Better you than me, mate." And I thought, what? How could you say something? And I said to him, how could you say something like that? And he said, because I'm in the British Army, and we've been at this a long time. And our attitude about this kind of thing is very, very different from yours. And he and I argued about it for a while, but I came to understand that after we talked. And he said to me, "Can you honestly say that you wish it was you instead of him?" And I thought about it, and I thought, well, no. And he said, "Well, maybe someday you'll be able to say that too," with a straight face. So I don't think it's uniquely American, but again, I think you have to understand the different historical experiences of the different countries.
I'm looking around this room, and I suspect that a few of you probably had the same experience. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and when I was in grade school, on November 11th every year at 11 o'clock, there would be, there would be a bell, there would be some kind of a stop in the school day, and everybody would stand up next to their desks, and there would be a moment of silence. It was, after all, the 11th day of the 11th month of the year, and what we were doing, of course, was remembering the armistice. We were remembering World War I. Pittsburghers had a sort of a connection to it. One of the first soldiers to fall, American soldiers to fall in the First World War, was a private by the name of Thomas Enright, and he was from Pittsburgh. And every Pittsburgh kid used to know those kinds of things. We knew our military history, and we commemorated that ceremony. It was in the 60s, during the Vietnam War, that began to change, and we quit doing that in the schools. And one of the reasons why I do what I do is because I was raised, well, my dad, the colonel, has a lot to do with this, and he belonged to a very active VFW post, and so we knew what we were doing every Memorial Day. We knew what we were doing every Veterans Day. And on Veterans Day in about 1966, as the parade was coming down the street, they noticed one thing, and that was, instead of the usual practice of every storefront being closed and everybody out watching the parade, the local Five and Dime had the audacity to remain open during the parade. When the VFW color guard came right up to the 5 and 10, the post commander gave the order for the color guard to stop. Then he ordered them to make a right face, and he marched the color guard right through the store. My dad was in the color guard. I was really intrigued by this whole thing, and marched them right back out. And he was, of course, the idea was to try to embarrass them and shame them into closing like everybody else had done. And they temporarily did close the store for the rest of the parade. But the next year, not only was that store open, but a half a dozen other stores were open, and it was never quite the same after that. And I thought then that we had lost something, and we never regained it. And so the last 10 years or so, if I'm in my classroom on November 11th, I walk into my class, and the first thing I'll say is, "Gentlemen, remove your headgear," because they're all wearing baseball caps. "Gentlemen, remove your headgear. Everybody, please rise." And then I'll just look at it and say, on the 11th day, on the 11th month, 1918, and explain why I asked them to stand and how we used to do that and why we don't do that anymore. And they all kind of go, "Cool." And then they'll sit down and we'll get on with things. And people will come up afterwards and thank me for that little memory and that little moment. And some of them will go home and talk to their grandparents and come back and say, "I talked to my grandfather and he remembers doing that." Okay, I feel old now, but we used to do things differently. I think we've lost something over the years, and I suspect the national divisiveness of Vietnam helps to explain some of that. It was interesting that you said about the Germans not celebrating anything. One of the constant challenges I have with my own academic colleagues, military history isn't quite the black sheep of the historical profession anymore, but I've had colleagues who ask me why I think this is so interesting and fascinating, and why am I busy celebrating American military history and all the death and all that. And I usually find ways to, I usually explain it to them some way or another that works for them. But the only time I've had an issue down here on the battlefield was with a group of German school teachers. We were up on Little Round Top, and I was explaining Colonel Chamberlain again. It's become a Chamberlain thing, I guess. And I'm explaining what went on, and I'm trying to explain it. And when I'm in the zone and I'm out there explaining what's going on, I'm not jumping up and down excited with a big smile on my face, but I do tend to tell a pretty good story after a certain point. And I noticed that several of the people had begun having their own little conversation, and they were talking over me. And at a certain point, I just got quiet. Now, you know what happens when the teacher gets quiet in the classroom and everybody's talking. They all shut up and say, what's going on? And I said, and I just asked, why are you having your discussion? I mean, am I boring you, or would you like to hear something different? We need to move on. No, we're just tired of hearing you celebrate American military history. And I walked away totally puzzled about what I was, why did they think I was celebrating it? Because that was not my intent, that was not my purpose, that's not what I thought I was doing. Sometimes the way we do things can be misread by the rest of the world, too.
What's coming across here, I think, is the phenomenon of change, and just referring to the Somme, the way wars and certain battles are commemorated actually evolves and changes over time. The way we think of the Somme, as we were talking about just now, this very somber view of the sort of futility of war and the loss of 20,000 men and 40,000 casualties, and the millions of men dead for over a pointless moving some general's drinks cabinet a few yards closer to Berlin. This is actually a product. This is not something that dates from World War I itself. The real change happened in the early '60s, and one of the catalysts was a Richard Attenborough film called "Oh, What a Lovely War," which not many people have seen or remember nowadays, but it had a colossal influence. With this idea of the Somme being this mass graveyard, and it was the worst battle of all time, and everyone died in it, and it just shows how. And it was all about the lions, the regular common soldiers who were led by donkeys, who were all these idiotic reactionary old duffers as the generals, and that's still present. And if you stop someone on the street, that's what they'll say. They'll say the Somme, because everyone knows it's the Somme, first day of the Somme, first day of the Somme. In the 1920s, 1930s, nobody talked about the first day of the Somme. It was just another battle. It wasn't that special, and to us that sounds incredible. But they had more commemorations about the unknown soldier and just general losses, because every village in England has a big war memorial, and if you go up there, you see 30 or 40 names of just young men who were killed. And yet, at the end of the day, but really, that view of the Somme is breaking down under sort of scrutiny in many ways, and that, the fact is, at the end of the day, the British and the French and the Americans, they did win the war. And so there's this idea that there's been too much focus on a single day of the war, the first day of the war, the first day of the Somme, and not enough on, say, 1917, or most importantly, the extraordinary performance of the British Army over 100 days in 1918, which led to the entire rapid collapse of the Imperial German Army. And if the British, if they hadn't signed if the Germans hadn't been smart enough to sign an armistice, the British and French force, and the American forces, of course, would have continued into Germany, and then in what's known as Plan 1919, they were going to build 20,000 tanks and have a colossal combined arms offensive using airplanes, artillery, everything like that, and they would have gotten to Berlin within a few weeks, and that would have been, and then you wouldn't have had a Hitler. He probably would have been killed during the fighting, and you wouldn't have had World War II or anything like that. So there's a lot to celebrate. I mean, I know it sounds a bit odd. There's a lot to celebrate about World War I, if that's the right term. So there's again today. This is breaking down this idea of the Somme. The Somme is the war, and it's not actually the war. I mean, the Somme, for instance, went on for another 3 or 4 months, and led to actually quite a few breakthroughs. So I think that's what's important, is that the way we think about battles and wars changes over time, and what is tragedy at one point is not necessarily a tragedy. I mean, it's always a tragedy, of course. Many people are killed at the Somme quite needlessly in many cases. But there's the way we regard the past and how we commemorate deaths or mass death changes over time, and I think in years to come there'll be a little less focus on the Somme, and a little bit more on the sort of the victory of 1918.
I wanted to change your question, Chris, about differences, and I wanted to make the point tonight of something. We've trained over the years. We've trained with a lot of different armies. We fought with a few more, but I've always wondered. I mean, I thought a long time. I thought years about this, about why do we have the record we have? Why is our army different? How do we view it? And of course, many of you are historians and read about the Army and its activities. And it dawns on me that our Army is not very disciplined. That'll strike you as odd because we have such a great track record. But it's not very disciplined as a group. There are certainly armies that are much more disciplined. And I said, well, why are we different? And so I start to look at things like adaptability to conditions. But there was one thing that struck me, and it is true whether or not I'm a historian or a veteran, and that is the sheer will to win. It is unparalleled in anything I've ever seen in any other army. If you take reasonably good care of your men, if you share the dangers with them, you can ask them to do anything, and they will do it. And that's what makes us different. Or they will die trying to do it.
We have a few minutes left for some questions. I'd like to open it up to the audience. Does anybody have a question for our panel? Yes, ma'am. For those of you that can't hear, she's referring to the poster, and it says the Civil War, how it changed everything. And the question is, how did the war change everything?
I think from a purely military history standpoint, you can't understand subsequent U.S. military organization and activity that happened after the Civil War without understanding the Civil War. The American way of war in the 20th century is largely shaped by the Civil War experience, by the United States Army's experience in the Civil War. Certainly not the Confederate States Army, because that was not a good experience for them. But so that just the way that the Army was organized, the way that people thought about how to prosecute military campaigns was very much driven in the 20th century by especially Grant's campaign in 1864, 1865 in the eastern part of the United States. Massive logistics, huge numbers of soldiers, and this dogged, we're going to fight it out on this line all summer if that's what it takes. And this notion that we are going to overwhelm these people. There's no finesse involved anymore. The other thing that's important about the Civil War from the Army's perspective is that after the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, there was never any assumption made by anybody in military circles that the regular Army would ever be anything more than a very small nugget, and that American combat would be done by militiamen, by the citizen soldier. After the Civil War, people like Emory Upton, who was actually a commander at Spotsylvania, began to argue that militiamen and volunteers don't work anymore, and we have to have a bigger regular army, and we can't rely on volunteers anymore. And that debate is still with us today, but it's largely been resolved by the fact that we have a very large active duty military. Not large relative to our population, certainly minuscule, but that started at the Civil War. And it's because of that experience at places like Bull Run, for example, where, as the British Command and Staff College referred to Bull Run as armed mobs chasing each other around in the woods. by the end of the war, it became pretty clear to everybody that given the stakes and given the complexities and everything else that was involved, you had to have professionals. And I think nothing has been the same since. From an American history perspective, obviously there's a lot more. But
in addition to that, I think another thing that the Civil War gave us was an understanding that soldiers engage in combat. Armies and generals fight battles and conduct campaigns. But nations and peoples go to war on the grand scale. I just got done visiting all 20 of our Penn State campuses over the course of the last year as part of being a laureate. And I offered them several different possible topics, and one of the topics for a talk that most of them picked was simply the question, one of the questions was, why study war? My lead off to that whole thing was a quotation I found in a newspaper published up in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. Now, Bellefonte's up in Center County, right smack in the center of the state. It's up where, it's right next to Penn State University. And the editor was mulling over the recent reports to come out of Maryland. It was late September 1862. It's right after Antietam. And the casualty list had come in, and they were long. And finally, in his editorial statement, he said, "Make no mistake about it, we are all in this war. Whether we support the war, whether we are opposed to the war, whether we are at the front lines or we watch for word of someone we've sent to the front lines, whether our heart is split, or whether our heartstrings are torn asunder by a rebel bullet, or whether we are able to welcome our loved one back home. Have no doubt about it, we are all in this war." And it went on to point out some things that, of course, we now know a whole lot more about. That the American soldier comes from towns and cities like the ones from which we come. They are our friends, they are our brothers and sisters, they are our sons and daughters, they are our neighbors, they are us. When we go to war, it's not just the Army that goes to war, it's all of us that goes to war. In the 20th century, now, we get it. In the Civil War, they didn't get it just yet. The Civil War was what taught them that, and that's what we still live with today. That's what it changed.
Not to put in a plug, but over the next 2 days, there'll be more Sacred Trust lectures that'll take place out front. All of them are focused around that theme, that one idea, how the Civil War changed everything. So I hope to come back. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
This is a live wire, right? So I'm going to step on this landmine for you, because I know there's probably a lot of reenactors in here. I think it's incredibly important. And it happens, it's interesting. It's a phenomenon. It happens all over the world, as you well know. Everybody does it, to some degree or another, except in Germany. Actually, I think they might do it too. I think, there's this notion of living history that, again, it's very difficult for people to conceptualize things without seeing them and touching them. And the notion that you can pick up a Civil War rifle so that you can see how much it weighs and how it feels in your hand, that you can wear a wool uniform on July 1st in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the bright sun and the humidity, and kind of understand what it's like to march 20 miles with cardboard shoes on and then fight a battle in that. So I think reenacting is incredibly important. I think where we run into trouble sometimes with reenacting is where it becomes an end in and of itself. I think the usefulness, at least from the perspective of an historian, is that reenacting is what can bring history to people. If the reenacting organization or the event is really just a closed, hermetically sealed thing that is just for the reenactors, it's not as useful. So I think it's great that the Park Service allows that to sort of happen here, not maybe on the scale that some of the reenactors would like. But I know, for example, in my experience in the Boston area, on Patriots Day weekend at Lexington and Concord, it's fantastic. And I was a scoutmaster for 7 years, and I always brought my Boy Scouts there and saw that, and they loved it because it really brings that home. So thank you for what you do, and I hope you keep doing it.
You got time for one more question. Yes, sir. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel today. Before I say goodnight again, I encourage you to come back tomorrow. We have a full slate of free lectures out front, as well as a full schedule of battle walks and real times out on the battlefield. So thank you again. Have a good night.
That was fun. Should have gone longer.